United Nations Program Director for Burma Task Force. There he seeks to promote both awareness and action on mass displacement, refugee rights, trafficking, and genocide prevention relevant to Rohingya crisis. He also promotes partnerships, for example, encouraging the formation of the Jewish Alliance of Concern over Burma, JACO. Mr. Carroll has worked at Amnesty International, Peace Corps, and 3 American Corps National Service programs. Mr. Carroll.
Yes, I'll stand because I've got
Dancing German Catholic. So the next slide, please.
We're indeed in a very cozy room here.
Okay.
The other way?
Maybe bring it back a little bit further away. Yeah. Okay, we'll get bits and pieces of this.
There you go.
Yep. Okay.
That's
So in short, we're concerned. We want the policymakers to use the word genocide. We want to see the UN and the U.S. Congress to be very active on this issue. In U.S. Congress, sanctions bills have been blocked for over a year, especially in the Senate by Mitch McConnell, who claims to be personal friends with Aung San Suu Kyi and is trying to misguidedly protect her. However, these sanctions bills don't target Aung San Suu Kyi, despite her complicity, but they target the military, who are the perpetrators of genocide. We're also interested in peacekeepers, as Sheikh Hasina has recommended, to facilitate eventual repatriation. Maybe you could just try to get rid of this thing.
Yeah, that would work.
Okay. And
Turn the screen a little bit this way.
Is that gonna? Yeah, I think that's probably
okay.
it's gonna be at an angle, but
all right.
it fits.
Very artistic. All right. So next slide. So besides rallies, of course, and speaking to lobbying and speaking to policymakers, we're at the UN, we're at Congress. We try to build. International religious freedom. So next slide. So again, I think you know about the Rohingya, but unfortunately this whole idea of their identity has become so politicized and distorted by certain Islamophobes. Next slide. So this, as you know, Amartya Sen, he said Rohingya did not come to Burma, Burma came to Rohingya. They certainly predate the colonial era. Burma was created around them. The borders were driven among them. And it's like the Rakhine Buddhists, they've been there for a long time. And instead, we have people like this, Ai Chan and some others, who are trying to claim that they never existed, they were brought over by the colonial powers, that their name is invented in the 1950s. A lot of baseless arguments, but there are certainly Islamophobes both in the United States and in Europe who also You have Kachin, you've got Shan, you've got Karen, you've got many other ethnic groups that are locked in struggle with the central government over generations. Rohingya have not been, in recent decades, at all violent, except for these very well-known attacks on border posts that unfortunately were used as pretext for the massive crackdown in 2016 and 2017. Next. So they've been marginalized over the years. As you know, they have had their citizenship taken away in 1982. Before that, they were citizens. There are various statements by elected leaders attesting to that fact. So they were rendered stateless. Next. As they became, they lost their rights one by one. They couldn't travel legally between villages. They were locked down. No rights to education. No rights to work. A living hell. A lack of rights. And not that was enough. These nationalist Buddhists could fill stadiums with hate, with denouncing this minority community, which is 2% of the entire population of Burma, and yet they were being discussed as a threat, as an existential threat to the entire nation. And people like this so-called scholar who's teaching in Japan call them viruses, call the Rohingya viruses. So you have a lot of this hate speech. Next. Of course, not all Buddhists, they don't all support this, but a lot of them in Burma are quiet, and there's a lot of propaganda. Time magazine several years ago did call out one of the major leaders, who is Wiratu, and against Muslims in general. Next. So we'll skip this over. This is just comparing Rakhine Buddhists. Rakhine State is in the northwest, and Rohingya Muslims in terms of what kind of rights they have and what kind of access to medical care. And of course, the Rohingya Muslims in this very poor state are suffering terribly. Next slide. So 300 mosques were burned, often with collusion of the local authorities. Next slide. And IDP camps were formed even before the crackdown in 2017. They said, "Oh, our algorithm, will solve everything." It didn't, and they are culpable or complicit, one might say. They have seen their error, but this is after a lot of suffering has gone on. They only months ago took down the Facebook pages of the generals who are responsible for the genocide, and of course that sparked a huge outcry among the nationalists in Burma. So again, place the next year, but many, many attacks and mass rapes, which have been very well documented by UN. Next. In August 25th, the day after Kofi Annan shared his roadmap to coexistence, the all hell broke loose in Rakhine State. 350 villages, 75% of all the Rohingya villages were burned by the military. Certain divisions, brigades of the Burmese army were brought in, already notorious for mass rapes in other ethnic states. And so they were brought in to do this dirty work. And I think you all know the terrible things, terrible atrocities against children, against women on a mass scale. Next slide. We'll skip over this, but this has all been really well documented by satellite imagery. Next. And also, as we know, there are mass graves, which brings us a bit to Wallon and his partner, because they were arrested exposing mass graves, mass killings, and brought into a kind of sting operation. But even worse than sting, they were handed documents and then arrested. And so this kind of setup was, as was mentioned earlier, admitted to by one of the participants in the military or the police, who has now been arrested, and his whole family has lost their lodging, has been evicted in collective punishment against them. So they have become a cause célèbre, and we have to say that there's a lot of attention to them. However, there are many other cases, and just keeping them on the screen for a minute, I wanted to read a couple of other quick cases that have come up that you may not be aware of. Well, of course, Fiona McGregor, starting with BBC. She was fired for mentioning the Rohingya mass rapes because her publication, the Myanmar Times, was pressured by the government. Radio Free Asia was corruption of a journalist, Ko So Mo Tun. One editor, chief editor of it's called Myanmar Now Media, he was charged defamation of the monk Wiratu. Wiratu had praised the killing of the chief lawyer of the NLD party, Aung San Suu Kyi's party, last year. He was very proud. He was celebrating killing this monk, this Buddhist monk. It's shocking, and yet when most of the lawsuits are from the government and not from the military. There have been 43 journalists charged in the last 2 years, and under 25 different charges. So it's a very harsh media environment. And there are some really brave people, next slide, who are speaking out. You know, it takes a lot in this environment for civil society to keep operating. A lot of them are being under watch, you know, by surveillance and so forth. And so they are doing very well to keep these cases, especially Wallon and his partner, alive. Next slide. So just to wind up quickly, because there's so much that could be said. Just recently, Aung San Suu Kyi in Vietnam, maybe you've heard, she stood her ground and said she didn't see anything wrong with the arrests, and to show her what was wrong with this whole thing. And, you know, ignoring the fact that it was a setup, ignoring so many injustices built in, and the mistreatment of the two journalists in jail where they were hooded and beaten. Next slide. Many of you are from Bangladesh. You're well aware of all the challenges in the refugee camps. Next slide. So I won't go into that now, but just to say that, you know, within Bangladesh, reporting on plans to move refugees to these islands, really low-lying, possibly quite unsafe. Dengar Char, Bashar Char, these different islands. These are very sensitive matters that the government seems to be trying to keep away from the media. There are some important stories. That said, government is doing great in terms of hosting so many refugees. Next slide. But unfortunately, has been playing along with Burma as far as periodically announcing, oh, there's going to be repatriation. The poor many countries, Russia recently, but others, sell arms to the military of Myanmar. This must stop. This is something that we have to demand that stops. We should not be allowing that. And we have peace laureates calling it a genocide, speaking out. We need more people. We need you to reach out and speak out. We have some flyers here on the table. Next slide. So afterwards, I hope you'll get a chance. This is one of the most wonderful advocates for the Rohingya. She's not a journalist, but she writes reports. There's a 443-page report that was just done by the UN. She also cooperated with it. She's banned from Burma, but she is the special rapporteur to Burma, and she's supposed to be there, having access to people, being able to report honestly about the human rights situation. Next slide. And I'll end just saying that because there's a possibility that because of the great impact of this crisis on Bangladesh, that Bangladesh, as a member of the International Criminal Court, can allow a referral in its name to the International Criminal Court, even though Burma is not a member. The U.S. doesn't like the ICC. A lot of countries are afraid of any limits on their sovereignty. But the International Criminal Court is an essential part of the human rights architecture of multilateralism, of the hope of justice. And so we are very hopeful that there will be some measure of justice eventually for the Rohingya through this mechanism. So thank you very much for listening.